It appears to be a truism in Washington, D.C. And by the way, I am Richard RJ Eskow, and of course, we are back on the 0 Hour. It appears to be a truism here in Washington, D.C. that the one way to get taken seriously by the media and political establishment is to support military intervention. Now, it doesn't matter if you have an end game for that military intervention. It doesn't matter if you can eloquently explain why that military intervention is called for. Simply standing for a military intervention seems to be enough to punch your card to be admitted to the big boys club here, and it is largely boys here in Washington, D.C. And here to talk about the latest, what I consider to be the latest example of that now is Gregory Shupak. Greg Shupak is a writer on politics and media. He is the author of the book, The Wrong Story, Palestine, Israel, and the Media. And he teaches media studies at the University of Guelph in Toronto, Canada. He joins us now. First of all, Greg, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Secondly, you wrote at fair.org, that's FAIR.org, excellent website. You wrote a piece on Rex Tillerson. Tell us what's going on with Rex Tillerson in the media.
Sure. Well, roughly 2 weeks ago now, Secretary of State Tillerson gave a speech at Stanford University in which he outlined U.S. plans for Syria, and he said that the U.S. military will stay in Syria indefinitely until several goals that he outlined are achieved. Those goals included the ousting of the Syrian government and the creation of conditions for refugees to be able to return. The goals included weakening Iranian influence in the country. And I think that those are three that I'd particularly want to highlight, but there were others as well.
So here's my, and it's a long term, here's my problem with Barack Obama's policy in Syria, Hillary Clinton's proposed policy in Syria, and now it appears to be the Trump administration and Rex Tillerson's policy in Syria. And correct me if you differ or disagree, but my sense is this, that while all of these policies say the objective is to get Assad out of power, all of the military activity is focused towards helping Assad defeat insurgent, ISIS-related groups. And so it seems like we're playing both. We're helping Assad while saying we want to get rid of Assad. We're helping some insurgent groups that we say are quote unquote okay, who probably turn out to be no more okay than any other groups. But it seems, my impression is that we're involved in both sides of this war while claiming to call for the defeat of both sides in this war. I don't know. What's your opinion?
I mean, there's some truth to what you said in the sense that certainly, U.S. involvement in Syria has at times been geared towards ostensibly playing a role in the fight against so-called Islamic State. And their defeat is one of the goals that Tillerson mentioned as well. But yet I would emphasize that the U.S. has made some significant efforts to try and oust the Syrian government. These include what the New York Times called one of the most expensive CIA operations in history. So, to the tune of over $1 billion a year, the U.S. funded opposition groups in Syria and equipped them with such things as, heavy anti-tank weaponry. So I think that it's true that they have on the one side helped in the fight against ISIS, which was an enemy of the Syrian government. But at the same time, even as they were in fact working to do that, they also were arming other groups in their efforts to try to defeat the Syrian government. And some of those groups have rather ugly characteristics of their own.
You know, it seems to me altogether to be a very muddled, unclear, so when we say, for example, lack of a really comprehensive strategy. So when Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State Tillerson, gives a speech saying we will be there, we will maintain military involvement in Syria until Assad is gone and refugees can return and so on. If he doesn't have any clear strategy for achieving that point, it's basically, it seems to me to be an open-ended commitment that we will continue a military involvement in an ongoing civil war.
Yeah, it is certainly, it certainly sounds like an open-ended commitment. And yeah, I would say that, I mean, yeah, one could argue that that there is some coherence to the strategy being to, if they can't outright force the Syrian government out, to at least kind of bleed and weaken it, and crucially also its allies, which include U.S. adversaries like the Iranian government, the Russian government, Hezbollah. So, I mean, you're right to point out that this goal of overthrowing the Syrian government is one that is going to receive a lot of pushback. So hence, I mean, the chances of achieving it at present anyway, or given the present alignment of forces, do not look all that likely. The U.S. has roughly 2,000 troops or so that we know of anyway in Syria. That's not going to be enough to overthrow the Syrian government. That government will not just politely, concede power, as it is shown throughout the course of the war. Neither will its allies. So it's at the very least, I think this policy is going to keep the war going, at least at some level, for the foreseeable future. And I think it's important to emphasize that one of the other dimensions to this is that basically the U.S. has, to this point, and we'll see what happens with the Turkish intervention, the U.S. has backed Kurdish forces in Syria, and that is, allowing basically a U.S. allied presence to control some fairly resource-rich territory in Syria, roughly 25% of it. So, carving up the Syrian state in that way is something that I think suggests a larger strategy of, if the Syrian government can't be entirely overthrown, then at least it can be remained in this state of instability and unable to fully rebuild following the war, and hence weak.
Well, and again, we're talking with Gregory Shupak, who is a professor of media studies and author, and his new piece at fair.org is Tillerson's Promise of More War in Syria, is how the headline begins. Now, let's get to the media's role in this then. It would seem to me that a smart, objective, and independent news media, and I realize I've already posed quite a hypothetical without even finishing my question, but it seems to me that a smart, objective news media would be asking, when the Secretary of State gives a speech of this kind, well, what are your markers that show you're moving in the right direction? How do you intend to achieve this end state? Will you need more than 2,000 troops? Is there a risk of inflaming the chance of war with Russia? What about could it destabilize the broader Middle East, given the involvement of Hezbollah and other external forces there? It seems to me there are an awful lot of tough questions that need to be asked. And Greg, reading your article on it, I get the impression that not only were those questions not asked, but that that Tillerson basically got a chorus of hallelujahs.
Yes, certainly. He received a lot of basically broad endorsements of the policy, and the questions that you mentioned were generally not asked, with some exceptions. But for the most part, there was, as you say, a chorus in favor of the policy in mainstream media outlets of the sorts that I discuss in the article: Newsweek, The Atlantic, The Washington Post. The questions that seem to have been asked mostly revolved around the tactics for achieving U.S. aims. There was another key question that wasn't asked. You pointed to several, but another key question that wasn't asked is, should the U.S. be pursuing these goals in the first place? Does it have any right to determine who does or does not govern Syria? Under international law, we know that it doesn't even, the U.S. military doesn't have a right to occupy Syria, since it's not been invited there by the Syrian government. So these fundamental questions surrounding international law, surrounding the justice of overthrowing governments, are completely off the map in terms of the debates such as they are that are taking place in mainstream media.
Well, Greg Shupak, you raise a great point there about whether we even have the right to do that. And I just want to read to you and to our audience a quote from the Defense Secretary, James Mattis, who gave a speech recently on what he described as a new military strategy for the country. And he said that he wants to create military readiness to confront China and Russia because, and I quote, "they are nations that seek to create a world consistent with their authoritarian models, pursuing veto authority over other nations' economic, diplomatic, and security decisions." Now, some might say that at least part of that statement could be applied to our interventions around the world, and that in fact it's not up to us. It should be up to maybe an international body or someone else to try to restore order in Syria. I don't know. What's your vision of a better way, a more appropriate and lawful way, perhaps, to go about dealing with the humanitarian tragedy there?
I think a negotiated political solution. There's nothing to suggest that that's easy or that the outcome will necessarily be perfect, but it's certainly preferable to work towards that as opposed to escalating the war, which is in effect what's happening when you say we're going to continue to stick by this goal of overthrowing the government of Syria and keeping troops there in contravention of international law. So quite early in the war, there were efforts to come to a negotiated solution, some of which held some promise. Who knows if they would have worked out, but they should have been at least pursued. You can read about this in, I think it was Hugh Roberts in the London Review of Books, had a long piece called, I think, The Hijackers, that outlined basically how the U.S. and its allies scuttled any efforts to reach a diplomatic solution. So what I would advocate is backing off regime change and directing all efforts towards a negotiated solution that, to the greatest extent possible, is determined by Syrians.
I think that's a great principle. And in closing, I can only say that I remain astonished that our media, it gets so excited, whether it's Trump lobbing a few Tomahawk missiles at an airport and suddenly today is the day he became president, or whether it's Tillerson, it just amazes me, this almost Pavlovian response that our media has to any display of injudicious military aggression. We got about a minute. Any closing thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I agree with what you're saying, and it seems that that's the only way Trump can win support from liberal sectors of the media, is by bombing other countries. It's it's a long history, this role of U.S. media aiding and abetting violations of international law by the United States ruling class, and I think that fundamentally it comes down to the structure of the media, which is embedded in the very same rule of glass that's carrying out these international policies that very often can be characterized as warmongering.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I do not disagree, and I'm sure somewhere in some media room in the country after Rex Tillerson gave that speech, somebody said, today is the day Rex Tillerson became Secretary of State. But we'll have to leave it there. Gregory Shupak, a media studies professor, author of the book, The Wrong Story, Palestine, Israel, and the Media. Thanks for writing on this, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.